The three men gathered in secret that night, inside the new study at Willowbrook, a room lined with leather-bound books Jeremiah Aldrich could not even read, and oil portraits of ancestors who had never claimed him. The air inside was heavy, almost wet, as though the very walls sensed the weight of their crimes. Each partner understood, though none dared say it aloud, that their empire of human misery was beginning to crumble. Marcus Devo, ever the most anxious, broke the silence first. He whispered that they should dissolve the partnership at once, burn every ledger, and scatter the ashes before the marshals arrived. Samuel Rochelle, the old sailor, urged caution instead. Move the money, quietly shift their assets to Havana, and let the investigation drift away with the tide. But Jeremiah Aldrich, he sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on a single flickering candle. In that wavering light, his mind was already far ahead of theirs, cold and methodical. He had chosen a third path, one so ruthless it revealed the true depths of the darkness inside him. He would remove them, both of them, and he would do it in such a way that suspicion would slide past him like water over stone. The plan came to him with the sharp clarity of pure malice murder. His partners staged the scene as a bloody quarrel over money and emerge as the sole survivor of a tragic dispute. With Devo and Rochelle dead, he could bury the evidence of their illegal trade and keep the fortune they had built together. The chosen night arrived in June of 1843, thick with humid air that clung to the skin. Aldrich summoned his partners to the very warehouse where the Delta Trading Company had once hidden its human cargo. The city had scheduled the building for demolition, its isolation after dark making it the perfect stage for murder. Jeremiah came early, a loaded pistol hidden in his coat, a razor-edged skinning knife tucked into his boot. His design was cruelly simple: shoot Marcus Devo first, then provoke Rochelle into a fatal struggle that would end with both men dead. 3 hired dock workers waited nearby, ready to swear they had seen Devo and Rochelle arguing violently about missing funds earlier that day. When his unsuspecting partners arrived, they found Jeremiah seated at their usual table. A bottle of fine whiskey waited between them, 3 clean glasses glittering in the lamplight, ledgers and shipping papers stacked like silent witnesses. The meeting began as any other, with Devo cataloguing their legal threats and Rochelle calmly outlining a plan to shelter their fortune in distant banks. But as the night deepened and the whiskey loosened tongues, Jeremiah began to steer the conversation softly, insistently, toward the location of their hidden cash reserves. It was Rochelle who sensed the wrongness first. Years at sea had sharpened his instincts. He noticed how Aldrich's eyes never lingered, how his right hand hovered too often near the fold of his coat, how his voice tightened when he asked for account numbers and keys. When the old captain suggested they adjourn until morning and return with lawyers present, Jeremiah understood that his moment was slipping away. The violence erupted like a thunderclap. Aldrich drew his pistol and fired into Marcus Devo's chest before the younger man could rise from his chair. The shot cracked through the empty warehouse, echoing off the wooden beams like the report of some ancient cannon. Devo fell back, wordless blood blooming across his white shirt, eyes wide with disbelief and betrayal. But Rochelle did not freeze. With the reflex of a man who had survived storms and mutinies, he heaved the heavy table aside and lunged with a jagged shard of whiskey glass. The glass bit across Aldrich's left cheek, opening a deep wound that would scar him for the rest of his life. What followed was a brutal, desperate struggle. 10 endless minutes of grunts, curses, and the splintering of crates. Ledgers scattered like frightened birds as the two men grappled for the knife Jeremiah pulled from his boot. Blood streaked the floorboards, each drop a silent witness to their fury. Rochelle fought like a man who knew exactly what was at stake and refused to die quietly. But age is a cruel ally. At 53, the sailor's strength began to fade. Jeremiah forced the blade upward, driving it deep into Rochelle's stomach and twisting until it pierced the heart. Even as the life drained from him, the old captain clawed at Aldrich's throat and forced out a final rasping curse. "My son knows everything. He will come for you. When he's old enough, he will make you pay." Jeremiah dismissed the words as a dying man's delirium. He could not yet imagine that Marcus Devo's younger brother Phipe had already begun recording their crimes, or that 17-year-old Henri Rochelle held detailed knowledge of every shipment, every ledger, every sin committed by the Delta Trading Company. For the next 4 hours, Jeremiah worked with chilling precision. He posed Devo's body to suggest a man shot while reaching for a weapon. He placed the bloody knife into Rochelle's stiffening hand, adding defensive cuts to make the fight look mutual. Money was scattered across the floor to mimic a quarrel over stolen funds. Even the office safe was dented and torn to imply a robbery gone wrong. Finally, Aldrich cut and bruised his own arms, a grotesque performance to sell the story of an innocent partner caught between two violent men. As dawn approached, the warehouse stood silent once more, its ledgers soaked in blood, its ghosts just beginning to stir. And Jeremiah Aldrich stepped into the humid Louisiana night, believing he had buried his partners, their fortune, and the truth itself. But could any man truly bury a curse spoken with a dying breath? Could he silence sons who carried both the memory and the proof of his crimes? The years ahead would answer those questions in ways Jeremiah Aldrich could never have foreseen. The false witnesses played their roles with chilling precision. Each man repeated his lines as though the night itself had rehearsed them. A pair of dockhands swore they had seen Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle arguing heatedly over missing partnership funds. Another worker, a man with a face creased by river wind and whiskey, claimed he heard shouts from the warehouse followed by the crack of gunfire and the unmistakable sounds of a violent struggle. And then there was Jeremiah Aldrich standing in the center of it all with a story as polished as the silver buttons on his coat. He told the police that he had gone to mediate a quarrel between his trusted partners only to walk into a nightmare, a deadly confrontation that left him fighting for his very life. His voice trembled in just the right places, his scar still raw from Rochelle's last desperate strike. The New Orleans police, overwhelmed with robberies, riots, and the endless violence of a restless port city, had little appetite for untangling the affairs of three seemingly respectable businessmen. Why pry deeper when the survivor's tale fit so neatly with the testimony of hired witnesses? The official report concluded that Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle had killed each other in a dispute over money, while Jeremiah Aldrich barely escaped their fate. A tragic misunderstanding closed and forgotten in the space of a single week. By the time the ink dried on that report, The old warehouse, their silent accomplice, was already gone. Demolished as planned, its blood-stained beams and scattered ledgers lost to the dust of the expanding port. Whatever evidence might have betrayed Aldrich was buried beneath brick and river silt. Freed of both partners and proof, Jeremiah moved quickly, almost gleefully. He presented himself as the sole surviving owner of a legitimate shipping enterprise, producing forged documents that claimed Devo and Rochelle had signed over their shares in the event of their untimely deaths. Banks that had once eyed the three partners with suspicion now welcomed the confident planter, whose cotton profits and polished manners spoke of stability and trust. Account by account, he emptied every safe deposit box, every hidden cache of coins and bills, every shadowed corner where their fortune slept. Nearly $40,000 flowed into his control, a sum that would surpass $1 million in today's currency. But the true prize was not just the money. It was silence. With Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle gone, Jeremiah believed he had erased the only men who could connect him to the Delta Trading Company's forbidden trade in human lives. He could now remake himself not as a smuggler or trafficker, but as a gentleman of Louisiana society, a man whose only scars were explained away as the tragic souvenirs of a partner's quarrel. What Jeremiah failed to consider what his ambition blinded him to were the living shadows left behind by the dead. Both Devo and Rochelle had families, brothers, sons, quiet witnesses who would spend not days or weeks, but years patiently weaving a revenge so intricate and devastating that death itself might one day feel like mercy. Philippe Devo was only 22 when his brother Marcus was buried. Unlike the older Devo men who often chased quick profit over careful planning, Philippe possessed a calculating mind that made him far more dangerous than Jeremiah could ever imagine. He had been Marcus's confidant, the quiet manager behind the scenes, and he had kept meticulous records-coded ledgers of every Delta trading transaction. Shipping manifests of forbidden Caribbean routes and letters that named the corrupt officials who kept their illegal trade alive. More than paperwork, Philippe carried something sharper suspicion. Long before the murders, he had never trusted Jeremiah Aldrich. There was something unsettling in the Kentuckians' eagerness to embrace the darkest corners of their business. Even in a trade built on human misery, Jeremiah's appetite for brutality felt excessive, as if cruelty itself was part of his ambition. Quietly, months before Marcus's death, Philippe began to dig. He uncovered inconsistencies in Jeremiah's past financial patterns that hinted at motives far more complex than simple greed. So when the news of Marcus's death reached him at the family's struggling plantation, his first emotion was not grief, but a cold, calculating fury. The official story smelled of rot. Marcus, desperate though he was, would never have confronted Samuel Rochelle with violence, and Rochelle, hardened sailor, though he had been, preferred negotiation to bloodshed. Worst of all, Jeremiah's account mentioned funds and accounts that Philippe knew had been moved to safer locations weeks earlier. Within days of the funeral, Philippe began his own investigation. He called in old contacts from Marcus's network. He bribed dock workers. He quietly obtained shipping manifests, and with a steady hand, reviewed what little evidence the police still held. What he discovered confirmed his darkest suspicions. The murders had not been a tragic business quarrel. They had been an execution carefully planned, expertly staged, and designed to erase the Delta Trading Company while enriching one man alone. And so, a new story began to take root. One Jeremiah Aldrich could neither predict nor escape. A story of patience, of vengeance, of shadows that would follow him long after the warehouse walls were gone. Have you ever wondered what hides the darkest secrets? Sometimes it's the most plausible stories. That night, the paid witnesses played their part. They told the police that they saw Devo and Rochelle arguing violently over money missing from the common fund. A dock worker, his face haggard and his voice heavy with alcohol, claimed he heard arguing coming from the warehouse around the time of the murder, and then gunshots, and the sounds of a violent struggle echoed through the darkness. But the most elaborate drama was Jeremiah Aldrich's explanation. He told a story that seemed plausible. He had come to mediate a dispute between two partners, but instead walked into a bloody scene, forced to risk his life to save it. The New Orleans police, overwhelmed by larger cases and eager to close the case against three seemingly respectable businessmen, accepted the story almost without further investigation. The official report concluded Devo and Rochelle killed each other in a money dispute, and Aldrich had only just escaped with his life. Within a week, the warehouse was demolished as planned, burying all evidence of Delta Trading's illegal activities under the rubble and dust of the harbor. With two partners dead and the entire property suddenly ownerless, Aldrich acted quickly. He presented himself as the sole surviving partner of a legitimate shipping company, producing cleverly forged documents showing that Devo and Rochelle had signed an agreement to transfer their shares to him in the event of their deaths. Banks that had been wary of the three strangers now trusted the plantation owner with a track record of successful cotton production. Aldrich emptied every account, every safe, every stash of cash. He estimated the total amount of assets he had stolen at nearly $40,000, the equivalent of over $1 million today. Most importantly, he eliminated the only two people who could incriminate him in the Delta Trading slave smuggling network, paving the way for him to recast himself as a respectable gentleman of Louisiana society. But in his triumphant ecstasy, Aldrich made a fatal mistake. He forgot the survivors, the families of the victims. Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle still had relatives young, intelligent, and patient to the point of cold. They would turn their grief into a fire of revenge, a plan that would stretch for years, so elaborate that death would seem a mercy compared to what awaited Aldrich. Philippe Devo, who was only 22 when his brother Marcus was murdered, was not like the hot-headed men of the clan. Behind his calm exterior lay a calculating mind that made him more dangerous than Aldrich could ever imagine. As Marcus's unofficial bookkeeper, Philippe kept detailed records of every transaction at Delta Trading, from coded ledgers of slave sales to shipping manifests on forbidden Caribbean routes to correspondence with corrupt officials. Philippe had been suspicious of Aldrich even before the murder. Something about the Kentucky man's brutal zeal unsettled him. He'd quietly investigated his background and discovered shady financials and puzzling gaps in his past. So when Philippe learned of his brother's death, his first reaction was not grief, but cold anger. The official report didn't convince anyone who knew the three partners. Marcus, though desperate for money, was extremely cautious. Rochelle, though a seafarer, was a rationalist, settling disputes through negotiation rather than gunfire. And most importantly, the details Aldrich gave about the funds having been transferred weeks earlier, a mistake that couldn't be overlooked. Within days of the funeral, Philip began his own investigation. He used his brother's network of contacts to question dock workers, pore over shipping records, even bribe the police to review the evidence. The results confirmed all suspicions. The crime scene had been staged, witnesses had been bribed, and Aldrich had begun withdrawing money from his partners within hours of their deaths. Meanwhile, Henry Rochelle Samuel's 24-year-old son was conducting a completely different investigation. With both his father's maritime connections and his formal education in law and commerce, Henry was uniquely positioned to follow the financial trail. He had worked in New Orleans banks and shipping companies, building a network of officials and clerks who were willing to provide information that Philippe's direct approach had difficulty accessing. What Henry discovered made his blood run cold. By combing through bank records, shipping manifests, and transfer papers, he paints a complete picture. Aldrich has stolen more than $60,000 in cash land and investments, a vast fortune accumulated from years of slave trading. But what makes Henry truly dangerous is his understanding of how Louisiana's financial system works. Unlike Philip, who wants to prove his guilt with direct evidence, Henry sees another path using Aldrich's own greed to trap him. The two young men first met in the fall of 1844, more than a year after the tragedy, in a discreet French Quarter diner. Philippe brought evidence, Henry brought his knowledge of financial law. They had no idea that their skills complemented each other so perfectly, nor that the desire for revenge would consume the next decade of their lives. By the spring of 1845, the plan had taken shape, an elaborate plot to destroy Jeremiah Aldrich using the same methods he had used: betrayal, financial manipulation, and finally, violence disguised as business. But unlike Aldrich's hasty ruthlessness, this plan would be executed slowly, patiently, and ruthlessly to the end. The first phase infiltrating Aldrich's social and commercial relationships. Philip, relying on his remaining connections in Louisiana's upper class, began frequenting gentlemen's clubs, political parties, and events where Aldrich also appeared to assert his status as the emerging cotton gentleman. Philip's goal was not to confront him directly, but to observe and memorize his habits, his weaknesses, especially his financial vulnerabilities. With the charm inherited from his late brother within months, Philip became a familiar face at Aldrich's meetings, friendly enough to share a drink with, but not important enough to be wary of. Meanwhile, Henry traced the financial empire Aldrich was building. He discovered that the entire enterprise, which seemed solid, was actually built on a fragile foundation: risky investments. Crop loans deals that yielded quick profits but left lasting consequences. And then, the most important discovery: Aldrich was addicted to gambling. He regularly blew thousands of dollars on poker and horse races, taking out increasingly reckless loans that mortgaged the plantation's future crops. It was this addiction that opened the door to revenge. By 1848, Henry had skillfully secured a position at the First National Bank of New Orleans, the bank that held the primary mortgage on Willowbrook Plantation. From this position, he quietly adjusted Aldrich's credit, slightly increasing interest rates, arranging payment schedules to make cash flow difficult during key seasons, gradually pushing him into dire straits. Meanwhile, Philip established relationships with the most notorious gambling organizers in New Orleans, who ran the games that could change lives overnight. With bribes and promises of rewards, he arranged for Aldrich to be invited to increasingly high-stakes games where all the opponents secretly cooperated just to ensure that Jeremiah Aldrich would lose more than he ever dared to imagine. Can you feel the slow, insidious heartbeat of revenge? The next New Orleans night was just beginning. And each step Aldrich took, though he thought it was lucky, was actually only deepening the trap woven of pain and patience. Have you ever thought? The most terrifying revenge lies not in the sound of a gun or a knife, but in time. In the patient, skillful hands slowly wearing down the opponent until he collapses on his own. The cold beauty of Philip and Henry's plan is precisely that patience. They do not rush to confront Aldrich, nor do they seek violence for quick revenge. Instead, they gradually destroy the financial foundation, the pillar that supports his social status and self-esteem. Each debt that comes due is a blow to the nerves. Each gambling loss adds another layer of despair. And each failed investment only makes him slide deeper each day, closer to a total collapse, where whatever final punishment they choose will become a nightmare with no way out. By 1851, the first cracks are visible. Aldrich's debts swelled to nearly $30,000, and the interest alone swallowed up most of the plantation's annual profits. He was forced to sell off several plots of land to make up for his losses. Word began to spread among Louisiana planters that Willowbrook Plantation, the pride of Jeremiah Aldrich, was in crisis. More importantly, his character began to show signs of cracking. The once confident, resourceful man became irritable, suspicious of his neighbors' motives, and increasingly desperate for new sources of money. Philip and Henry, however, wanted more than just to see him bankrupt. They craved a deeper revenge, to make Aldrich experience the humiliation and fear their loved ones had endured in their final moments. They wanted him to understand that his entire fortune had been built on blood and betrayal, that his respectable gentleman persona was an illusion, and that justice, however slow, would find its way. The final stage of the plan would push Aldrich past the point of financial despair, forcing him to accept whatever terms they laid down, no matter how humiliating or dangerous. They needed him alive at least long enough to fully experience the sophistication and brutality of the sentence they had woven. It was Henry who devised the most vicious method, weaponizing each plantation owner's innate fear. Every slave owner was haunted by the prospect of rebellion, and that fear could be exploited without actually revolting. Henry proposed a more subtle approach, a slow but deadly cut forcing Aldrich to marry one of his own slaves, a forced, public, legal marriage, one that would crush his honor and status and bind him in a relationship from which the law would prevent him from escaping. To make this idea a reality, they needed a special woman. For months, Philip and Henry silently observed each person on Willowbrook Plantation, looking for someone whose forced marriage to Aldrich would cause maximum social damage, but who was also powerful enough to be a loyal ally in this dangerous game. And they found Celeste. Celeste's selection was no accident. At 38, she was a tall woman, but her stature was the least important thing in the eyes of the two avengers. What made Celeste invaluable was her intellect, her keen survival instincts, and above all, her absolute hatred for Jeremiah Aldrich. Unlike many oppressed people who had learned to mask their emotions behind a mask of obedience, Celeste never bothered to hide her contempt. She did her job as head cook neatly without complaint. But anyone who watched closely could see a cold fire burning in her eyes whenever Aldrich appeared. That fire was rooted in a personal tragedy. In 1847, Aldrich had bought Celeste from a failing plantation in Mississippi. In the moment of the transaction, she was torn from her husband and 3 children, each sold to a different place, each drifting to a different state. Can you imagine the pain separated from her own flesh and blood, without a word of farewell, with only a burning memory and a name to pay for? For Philippe and Henry, Celeste was the perfect match. She not only possessed the hatred needed to cooperate, but also the intelligence to understand this complex plan of revenge and the will to withstand the coming storm. They had found not just a tool, but an ally. And from that moment, Jeremiah Aldrich's fate was sealed. Can you hear the story's heartbeat slowly tightening? Every step Aldrich took, every look, every debt were now just pieces in a game arranged from the pain of people he once considered invisible. The cruelty of Jeremiah Aldrich's decision had never been about money. The separation of Celeste from her family was not an economic necessity. He could easily have purchased her husband and children along with her. Willowbrook Plantation had the means, and Aldrich's ledgers proved it. But in 1847, when the sale was arranged, he chose only Celeste because he needed an experienced cook and saw no profit in what he dismissively called unnecessary mouths to feed. When Celeste, desperate and trembling, begged him to at least buy her youngest child, a daughter barely 10 years old, Aldrich laughed. His reply was cruel in its casualness. He was running a plantation, he said, not an orphanage for colored children. For 7 long years, Celeste endured the daily humiliation of preparing lavish meals for the man who had destroyed her family. Every night she cooked expensive delicacies for his guests while surviving on scraps and kitchen leftovers. She stood silent, while Aldrich boasted of his business triumphs, knowing each fortune had been built on stolen money and murdered partners. She cleaned blood from his clothes after his mysterious midnight excursions. She watched him burn documents and letters in the kitchen fireplace during frantic efforts to hide evidence of his collapsing finances. And all the while, Celeste was learning. She noted the details of his life with quiet precision. His daily routines, his private habits, the medicines he relied on for chronic stomach pains, the rooms he favored when pacing through sleepless nights. She knew which dishes he loved most, which creditors frightened him, which fears haunted him when he thought no one was watching. This hard-won knowledge made her a priceless ally for anyone seeking to harm or manipulate her owner. For Philippe and Henri, it was a revelation. Contacting her required exquisite caution. Neither man could risk direct approach. Any unauthorized meeting with an enslaved person would bring suspicion and possible arrest. Instead, they relied on intermediaries, free people of color who worked New Orleans markets and could visit rural plantations without raising alarms. Through these quiet messengers, a line of communication slowly formed. At first, they offered small sums of money in exchange for harmless observations, details of Aldrich's routines, his business trips, his habits. What they learned exceeded even their darkest hopes. Celeste was not merely observant, she had already been waging her own subtle war. For years, she had been carefully oversalting his food to inflame his stomach ailments, accidentally breaking his favorite dishes and whispering rumors among the enslaved that his finances were failing and that he might sell them off to cover debts. Every act was calculated, deniable, and cruelly effective. Her quiet sabotage deepened his paranoia without ever giving him proof. When Philippe and Henri finally revealed who they were and the vengeance they sought, Celeste's answer came without hesitation. She would help. She would do anything required to destroy the man who had murdered their relatives and shattered her life. Her only condition was freedom's safe passage to Canada, where she dreamed of finding the children torn from her years before. Philippe and Henri agreed at once. They recognized in Celeste not just a tool, but a partner whose hatred aligned perfectly with their own thirst for justice. Together, they began shaping the final act of their plan. Aldrich would first be driven into utter financial ruin. Through manipulated gambling losses and carefully timed demands from creditors, he would be left desperate and isolated. Then, when every path of escape was closed, they would present him with a single poisonous choice: marry Celeste in a legal ceremony or face immediate destruction at the hands of his creditors. Such a marriage would annihilate his social standing, place Philippe and Henri in legal control of his property through Celeste, and most important position, her to administer a slow, deliberate poison. A death that would echo the agony their murdered kin had once endured. Timing, however, was everything. They needed a moment when Aldrich's finances were at their weakest, when isolation and fear would drive him toward any lifeline, no matter how degrading. That moment arrived in early 1854. Henri learned that Aldrich planned to attend a high-stakes gambling tournament in New Orleans. His final attempt to win the money needed to save Willowbrook from foreclosure. It would be there, amid the smoky cards and desperate wagers of New Orleans gaming halls, that their trap would finally close. Aldrich would be lured into a game he could not win, and when ruin came crashing down, the terms of his survival would be set in writing a wedding vow that would be remembered not as love, but as the opening line of his slow, merciless destruction. The gambling den, where Jeremiah Aldrich would meet his fate, occupied a converted warehouse near the New Orleans waterfront, a cavern of smoke and shadows where the city's most desperate men came to wager fortunes on the turn of a card or the roll of dice. On a February night in 1854, the air outside was heavy and wet, a humid darkness that carried fog from the Mississippi and wrapped the streets in a muffled gray. Gas lamps burned dim behind the mist, their light bending like figures in a dream. Aldrich arrived shortly after nightfall, a leather satchel clutched in his hand. Inside it lay $8,000, nearly every liquid asset he could scrape together from the sale of slaves' equipment and personal property at Willowbrook Plantation. This was the last of his fortune, his single desperate attempt to win enough money to satisfy his creditors and prevent the foreclosure that threatened to erase the life he had built from murder and theft. What he did not know was that Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle had spent months orchestrating this evening, ensuring that every man at the high-stakes table would be working toward a single purpose: the total destruction of Jeremiah Aldrich. The game was 5-card stud poker. Stakes began at $500 a hand and escalated rapidly as the night wore on. At first, Fortune seemed to smile on Aldrich. He won several smaller pots, enough to make him believe against all reason that his luck had finally turned. But as the stakes climbed and whiskey loosened, his cautioned desperation clouded his judgment. He began to place reckless bets, driven by the intoxicating mixture of fear and the fleeting triumph of early victories. By midnight, more than half his stake was gone. Still, he played eyes glittering with the fever of a man who knew this table was his last chance to save not only his plantation but his very name. Following Philip's careful instructions, the other players allowed him occasional wins to keep him seated, then tightened the noose, raising the bets until each draw represented the remainder of his wealth. The final hand began shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning. Outside, the river fog had thickened to an almost supernatural density. Even the nearest street lamps cast only faint halos through the warehouse windows. The dealer slid the cards across the felt. Aldrich looked down to see a promising spread, a pair of kings, showing with the hidden potential for a full house. His pulse quickened. Surely this was the hand that would redeem him. With a surge of reckless confidence, he pushed his remaining $3,000 into the pot. The others followed with quiet precision, each move feeding the illusion that fortune might finally favor him. When the final cards were revealed, the illusion shattered. A cold-eyed stranger across the table laid down a full house, an unassailable hand that crushed Aldrich's pair of kings and claimed the enormous pot. The room seemed to contract around him. The other players collected their winnings and departed without a word, their footsteps fading into the fog. Only the stranger remained, studying Aldrich with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a trapped specimen. Minutes passed in oppressive silence before the man finally spoke, his voice carrying a faint French accent that stirred a memory Aldrich could not immediately place. "Mr. Aldrich," the stranger said evenly, "I believe we need to discuss your outstanding obligations. The gentlemen who have just departed are not merely gamblers. They represent certain business interests that have been patient with your financial difficulties. But patience, like luck, eventually runs out." Before Aldrich could respond, a figure stepped from the shadows near the warehouse entrance. Gaslight flickered across his face, and Aldrich felt his blood turn to ice. The resemblance was unmistakable. Features he had last seen contorted in pain 11 years earlier as Marcus Devo died with a bullet in his chest. "You look as though you've seen a ghost," Jeremiah the newcomer said, moving toward the table with a predator's grace. "Perhaps because you have. My name is Philippe Devo, and I believe you knew my older brother Marcus quite well. In fact, you were the last person to see him alive, weren't you?" The humid Louisiana air suddenly felt frigid. Aldrich's hands began to tremble as understanding crashed over him. This was no random poker game, no miraculous chance to reclaim his fortune. It was a carefully built trap, years of patient hatred now closing, like an iron cage. Another figure emerged from the far corner of the warehouse, completing the triangle around the table. Henri Rochelle stepped forward, his eyes alight with a colder, older fury. "My father Samuel always said you were clever, Mr. Aldrich. Clever enough to murder 2 men and steal their life's work, but apparently not clever enough to realize that dead men sometimes leave behind sons who remember every story and never forget their father's killers." The warehouse fell silent, except for the distant groan of ship horns echoing across the fog-shrouded river. Aldrich sat frozen-minded, racing through possible escapes and finding none. He was a lone bankrupt, and surrounded by men who had spent more than a decade plotting this moment. Philippe pulled out the chair across from him and sat with deliberate care. "We know everything, Jeremiah. We know about the Delta Trading Company and your illegal slave trading operations. We know about the warehouse where you murdered our fathers in cold blood. We know about the forged documents, the bribed witnesses, the systematic theft of everything they built. Most importantly, we know that you have been living on blood money for 11 years, building your respectable plantation life on their corpses." Henri stepped closer and placed a leather folder on the table, spreading its contents like evidence before a judge. "These," he said, "are copies of every financial transaction you've made since 1843. Bank records showing how you looted our father's accounts. Property transfers proving how you seized assets that rightfully belonged to their estates. Even letters from the corrupt officials who helped you hide your crimes. Officials who now care far more about protecting themselves than protecting you. The papers lay between them, silent as a verdict." Outside the river, fog thickened until the warehouse seemed adrift in another world, cut off from every ally Jeremiah Aldrich had ever counted on. And across the table, the sons of the murdered waited for his next breath. The evidence spread across the poker table left no room for denial. Jeremiah Aldrich stared at the papers with a growing sense of unreality. He recognized bank ledgers he had personally altered, contracts he thought had been burned years ago, even letters he had once hidden beneath floorboards and later consigned to fire. And yet, here they were, financial records, sworn statements, and eyewitness testimonies gathered through patient bribery and relentless investigation. Documents so meticulously prepared they could not only convict him in any court of law, but implicate dozens of prominent Louisiana citizens who had unknowingly helped him launder the wealth he had stolen in blood. Philippe Deveau tapped a single page with deliberate precision. "The question," he said softly, "is not whether you are guilty. It is what we intend to do with this information. We could, for example, present these records to the federal authorities. They would be very interested in prosecuting not only you, but every banker and merchant who helped weave your stolen money into Louisiana's economy. Or we might prefer to share our findings with certain parties in New Orleans. Powerful men who believe you to be a trusted associate. Men who would not take kindly to learning they have been doing business for more than a decade with a murderer and a thief." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "I suspect either course would end in your death, Jeremiah, and not a quick one." For a long moment, Aldrich could only stare, the fog-damp air pressing like a vice against his lungs. When his voice finally emerged, it was a ragged whisper. What do you want money? I can raise money. The plantation, your plantation is worthless." Henri Rochelle interrupted, his tone almost bored. "We hold the mortgage. Remember? Along with most of your other debts. Every loan you've taken, every gambling obligation you've incurred, every desperate financial arrangement that's kept you afloat, it all belongs to us now. We have been acquiring your obligations for years, Mr. Aldrich, piece by piece. You own nothing. You have nothing left to bargain with but your life. And frankly," Henri allowed the silence to stretch like a blade, We are not particularly interested in preserving that either. The warehouse seemed to grow colder as the truth settled over Aldrich like a shroud. He was not merely bankrupt. He was stripped of every shield, every ally, every illusion of power. The comfortable life he had constructed from murder and stolen wealth had been dismantled with surgical precision by the sons of the men he had killed. Yet, some stubborn corner of his mind refused to surrender. Surely there must be a way out. Death, though looming, was not inevitable. Philippe leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful, almost courteous. "There is," he said at last, "one alternative. One way you might continue breathing at least for a while. It would require a sacrifice of dignity, a public acknowledgement of who you truly are, and a demonstration of your absolute submission to our authority." Henri's cold smile deepened. "You are going to marry one of your slaves, Jeremiah. Publicly, legally, permanently. You will stand before God in the state of Louisiana and take your cook Celeste as your lawful wedded wife. You will live as her husband, share her bed, and present yourself to your neighbors as a man who chose to marry his own property." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a heartbeat, Aldrich simply stared, unable to process the enormity of what he had heard. Marriage between a white planter and an enslaved woman was not merely scandalous. It was unthinkable social annihilation. Legal suicide, a humiliation so complete that death itself seemed merciful by comparison. "You're insane," he finally managed, his voice breaking. "No one would perform such a ceremony. No court would recognize." Actually, Philippe interrupted with unnerving calm. "We have already made the necessary arrangements. There is a minister in Natchitoches parish who happens to be deeply in debt to certain gambling establishments. He has agreed to conduct a perfectly legal ceremony, properly witnessed and documented. And as for the courts, Louisiana law is quite clear. A marriage contract once executed is binding, regardless of the circumstances under which it was made. You would be legally married to Celeste with all the rights and obligations that entails." Henri leaned forward, his eyes glittering with cruel satisfaction. "The beauty of this arrangement, Mr. Aldrich, is that it gives you a choice. You may refuse our generous offer and face the immediate consequences of your crimes, consequences involving more physical pain than you can imagine. Or you may accept humiliation in exchange for continued life, however degraded that life may become." The warehouse was silent, but for the distant moan of river foghorns. Between the piles of incriminating documents and the cold eyes of the men who had spent 11 years building this moment, Jeremiah Aldrich understood that the choice before him was not life or death. It was death quickly, or death by slow living ruin. The warehouse held its breath, a cavern of damp wood and echoing shadows. Aldrich stood frozen in the center of that silence. Every heartbeat a hollow drum against the cold air. Before him lay a mountain of proof letters, he believed long-burned ledgers pulled from hidden safes' testimony, whispered into sworn statements by people who had once sworn to remain silent. Names he thought lost to the river were etched on those pages like ghosts refusing to stay buried. He recognized each signature with a dread that hollowed his chest. How could they have found all of this? Who had they bribed? Who had they followed? Who had they broken to gather so many pieces of his life? Philippe's voice sliced through the stillness, smooth and deliberate. "The question," he said, almost gently, "is not whether you are guilty. We all know the answer to that. The question is, what we should do with this information. His words lingered like smoke. Would they hand it to the federal authorities, who would seize not only Aldrich, but every banker and merchant who had unknowingly helped him launder his stolen fortune? Or, Philippe's eyes gleamed, they could simply whisper the truth to certain men in New Orleans. Men who had lost friends to mysterious accidents. Men who believed in vengeance more than law. What would such men do if they learned that Aldrich had lived for a decade behind a mask of respectability built on the murder of their associates? The answer needed no explanation. Aldrich's voice finally emerged, ragged and small. What do you want? Money? My plantation. Worthless. Henri interrupted, his tone sharp as a knife. We hold the mortgage. We hold every note you signed, every debt you thought hidden. Every loan, every gambling slip, every desperate agreement, each one belongs to us now. You have nothing left to bargain with save your life, and even that... Henri leaned forward, the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth. Even that holds little interest for us. The warehouse seemed to contract around them, its timbers groaning in the damp air. Aldrich felt the weight of their plan pressing in a slow tightening of ropes he had never seen tied. Everything he had built, every dinner invitation, every whispered acknowledgement of respect was ashes in their hands. And yet, some stubborn, half-delirious part of him still refused to accept that death was the only ending. Philippe tilted his head as though considering a gift. There is one alternative, he said at last. One way you might keep breathing, but it will require a sacrifice of dignity. Henri's smile sharpened. You're going to marry one of your slaves, Jeremiah. Publicly, legally, permanently. You will stand before God and Louisiana society and take your cook, Celeste, as your lawful wedded wife. You will sleep in her bed, live in her house, and present yourself to your neighbors as a man who chose to marry his own property. For a long moment, Aldrich simply stared, unable to form words. Marriage between a white plantation owner and an enslaved woman was more than scandal. It was social suicide, legal ruin, a humiliation so complete that death began to seem merciful. You're insane, he whispered. No preacher would, no court would ever. Actually, Philippe said smoothly, arrangements have been made. A minister in Natchitoches parish, deep in debt and eager for relief, will perform the ceremony. Louisiana law is quite clear: once a marriage is witnessed and recorded, it binds for life. Henri leaned close, his eyes glittering. So you have a choice. Refuse and face immediate consequences, painful ones, or accept and endure a life of slow humiliation. A life that may not be as long as you imagine. The silence returned, heavy and wet. Death would be final, but at least his neighbors might remember him as a gambler, a failed planter, never as a murderer. Marriage to Celeste, however, would strip away every mask while leaving him alive to feel the scorn. How long, he asked at last, voice trembling. How long would it last? For the rest of your natural life. Philippe replied softly. Marriage is sacred, and given your health, that natural life may not be as long as you hope. The choice was a noose in two directions, a quick drop into the river or a slow death beneath society's gaze. Which would you choose if you stood where Aldrich stood? He tried one last plea. If I agree, What guarantee do I have you won't kill me anyway? None, Henri said simply. But you have our word that your death, when it comes, will be far more pleasant than what we had planned. Think of the marriage as an opportunity to demonstrate good behavior. Compliance will be rewarded. Resistance will be punished. Creatively. Felipe produced a folded document from his coat and laid it atop the damning evidence. This is the contract. Properly prepared, properly legal. The ceremony is tomorrow evening at Willowbrook Plantation. Your neighbors will witness your voluntary union with Celeste. They've been told you have experienced a religious awakening, that you wish to elevate one of your slaves to wife as an act of Christian charity. The final cruelty was clear. He must present the marriage as his own idea. No one would suspect coercion. No one else even remembered the names Marcus Devo or Samuel Rochelle, the murdered men whose sons now held the pen. Aldrich reached for the contract with hands that shook so violently the paper rattled like dry leaves. The terms were merciless. He would marry Celeste, live with her as husband, provide for her as law required. In return, his creditors would stay their hand and allow him to continue running Willowbrook under their watchful eyes. Perhaps he thought desperately he could escape after signing. Flee the state, find a legal loophole, appeal to some higher court. But even as the thoughts flickered, he saw the satisfaction in their eyes. They had planned this night for over a decade. Every avenue of escape had already been sealed. Welcome to the family, brother-in-law, Felipe said softly, collecting the signed contract. We'll see you tomorrow. Dress appropriately. March 15th, 1854 dawned grey and heavy, the air swollen with the stench of the swamps. Aldrich had not slept. He paced his study through the long night, staring at the paper that ended 15 years of ambition. Celeste was informed through intermediaries, though she feigned surprise when he awkwardly explained the arrangement over breakfast. She listened with patient stillness, her eyes calm as a deep river. When he finished, she simply nodded. Yes, Master Aldrich, I understand. I will prepare myself for the ceremony. Her quiet acceptance chilled him more than fury ever could. Had she known all along? As she moved about the kitchen, steady and efficient, Aldrich felt the slow, inevitable tightening of a net that had been woven long before he ever sensed the trap. Throughout that heavy, humid day, carriages creaked along the muddy roads leading to Willowbrook Plantation. One by one, neighbors and curious acquaintances arrived, answering invitations. They believed came from Jeremiah Aldrich himself. The cards, written in a careful, elegant hand, spoke of a remarkable act of Christian charity. Their troubled neighbor, it said, wished to honor a loyal servant by offering her the dignity of marriage. What would you have thought if such an envelope appeared on your doorstep? A jest. A desperate plea for attention from a man whose finances had begun to crumble. Most guests came expecting spectacle. A half-mad planter, performing some theatrical penance for his gambling debts. Instead, they found a perfectly arranged wedding. Fresh flowers, white and faintly fragrant despite the swampy air, were tucked into garlands along the veranda. Tables bore chilled punch and silver trays of sugared pecans. A nervous groom stood among the decorations, his fine coat buttoned to the throat. A fixed smile pressed over a face drained of color. Aldrich played his role with the desperate conviction of a man who knew survival depended on the illusion of choice. When questioned, he repeated the story of a sudden religious conversion of Christian duty and the call to elevate the faithful. He spoke softly, but with a conviction that to most ears sounded just believable enough. Would you have believed him or sensed the shadow of a threat beneath his trembling voice? Celeste appeared as the sun began to fade behind the moss-hung trees. She wore a simple gown of cream linen, elegant in its restraint. At 38, she was broad-shouldered and solid, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that unsettled the more skeptical guests. Her smile, warm and deliberate, belonged to a woman who understood the magnitude of the moment. When she thanked the crowd for witnessing the most important day of my life, several women exchanged uneasy glances. Was this devotion or something more carefully rehearsed? The minister, a debt-burdened man from Nachitoches parish, performed the ceremony with professional efficiency. He read the vows in the same steady tone he might use for any respectable union. When he reached the familiar words, "Speak now or forever, hold your peace," a rustle moved through the assembled crowd. But no voice rose to challenge what appeared on paper, at least, to be a voluntary marriage between two consenting adults. Aldrich's reply was barely audible, a dry whisper that scarcely reached the front row. Celeste's answers, by contrast, rang clear and confident. She promised to love, honor, and obey with a conviction that made the spectacle feel almost ordinary, as though marriages between white plantation owners and enslaved women were simply another quirk of Louisiana society. Then came the final cruelty. The minister pronounced them husband and wife and gently instructed Aldrich to kiss his bride. For an instant, the groom swayed, his face pale as candle wax. Would he collapse? Would he flee? Celeste steadied him with surprising gentleness and, rising on her toes, pressed a brief, chaste kiss to his lips. The crowd exhaled. The union was sealed, and the true punishment had begun. As the guests departed, some laughing nervously, others shaking their heads in bewilderment, Aldrich led his new wife back into the house that had once been his proud sanctuary. But the rooms no longer felt familiar. The polished banisters and oil paintings seemed to tilt and shift as though the very walls rejected their former master. Celeste walked through the halls with quiet authority, her footsteps sure and unhurried. She moved furniture, adjusted curtains, opened and closed doors with the calm precision of someone claiming what was already hers. When Aldrich attempted a timid objection, she turned and fixed him with a gaze sharp enough to pierce bone. "We're married now, Jeremiah," she said softly. "Husband and wife, partners. It's time we began to act like it, don't you think?" That first night, as they lay in the bed that had once been his private refuge, Aldrich felt the weight of the trap settle fully into place. His enemies had not granted him mere survival. They had crafted a punishment more exquisite than death. Every breath beside Celeste, every shared meal, every polite word of affection would be a daily reminder of the blood and theft upon which his fortune had been built. And yet, the true horror was only beginning. The first month unfolded with deceptive calm. Celeste adapted to her new role with an elegance that impressed even the few neighbors bold enough to visit. She managed the household staff with firm authority, entertained guests with measured charm, and maintained the delicate social facade that allowed Aldrich to cling to the faint outline of his former respectability. To the outside world, the unlikely marriage seemed almost functional, even respectable in its own strange way. But within the walls of Willowbrook, small changes crept in, like damp rising through old brick. Aldrich's morning coffee carried a faint bitterness he could not name. Evening meals, beautifully prepared, seasoned as they always had been, left him vaguely nauseated, his limbs heavy with unexplainable fatigue. Headaches came next sudden and sharp, followed by spells of dizziness that seemed to intensify whenever Celeste lingered nearby. Was it simply the strain of humiliation, the toll of sleepless nights and whispered gossip? Or was something far more deliberate at work, hidden behind her serene smile? Each passing day tightened the invisible cords of her quiet revenge. And Aldrich, once a master of life and death, could only sit beneath the darkening eaves of Willowbrook and wonder what fate awaited him next. Would you have noticed the change in the taste of your coffee? Would you have dared to ask? Or would you, like Aldrich, swallow each bitter sip and hope foolishly that it was nothing more than stress? Sometimes history's most terrifying punishments begin not with a scream, but with a single quiet cup of coffee. The humiliation of Jeremiah Aldrich's forced marriage was only the opening act. It was not merely the public degradation that broke him, but the quiet realization that his very survival now depended on the unpredictable mercy of Philip and Henri. Each day of their calculated silence tightened the invisible chains around his life. His dignity had been stripped away in a single ceremony, but the deeper torture lay in knowing that his fate rested entirely in the hands of men who despised him. The body will often rebel when the mind is under such relentless strain, and soon Aldrich began to feel the creeping signs of illness. At first, it was easy to explain away spells of nausea, after meals a persistent heaviness in his limbs, sudden moments of weakness that left him breathless in the middle of ordinary tasks. But as the weeks passed and his condition worsened, a more sinister suspicion began to take root. This was no simple ailment brought on by stress. The symptoms followed too neat a pattern, a slow, deliberate progression that felt like the careful tightening of a noose. His fears were confirmed one humid evening when Dr. Hamilton Warren Willowbrook's longtime physician arrived to examine him after Aldrich collapsed during a tense business meeting with prospective cotton buyers. Dr. Warren's examination was thorough but grim. He set aside his instruments and looked at his patient with a troubled expression. "Your condition is serious, Mr. Aldrich," he said, his voice measured but firm. "The symptoms suggest prolonged exposure to a toxic substance, arsenic, or a similar metallic poison. This is not the work of days or even weeks. Such poisoning accumulates over months, weakening the digestive system and attacking the nerves. Without immediate treatment and removal from the source, it is always fatal." The words landed like a death sentence. Aldrich's heart hammered as the truth crystallized. Someone was feeding him death in slow, careful doses. And in the shadowed corners of his mind, there was no doubt who that someone must be. Celeste. The thought alone was a nightmare, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. Every meal she prepared, every cup she offered, carried the quiet possibility of murder. The realization that his own wife, his enslaved wife, was the instrument of this silent destruction brought a cold terror that no financial ruin could match. And yet, what could he do? To accuse Celeste directly would be worse than futile. She was shielded by the law by her apparent innocence, and most dangerously, by the protection of Philip and Henri. Any accusation, no matter how impassioned, would be dismissed as the paranoid ramblings of a man already disgraced. If Aldrich dared to confront her and failed to prove his claim, he would only invite ridicule and perhaps the very violence he feared. A single denial from Celeste would leave him at the mercy of two men who had made it their life's work to unmake him. Driven by desperation, Aldrich began to take secret precautions. He prepared his own meals in a locked study using ingredients he purchased and inspected himself. He drew water from a hidden well that only he could access. He refused wine or tea unless he had poured it with his own hand. At night, he abandoned the marital bedroom and slept in a guest chamber secured by a heavy lock, fearful of what might be slipped into his food or applied to his pillow while he slept. These measures gave him a fragile sense of control, but they also betrayed him in subtler ways. Neighbors who visited Willowbrook could not help but notice the changes. His once imposing figure grew gaunt. His eyes darted nervously whenever a servant entered the room. He flinched at the sight of food prepared by anyone but himself. And he never ever touched the elaborate meals Celeste placed before him with patient devotion. Whispers began to circulate among the parish families. Some said the strain of his unusual marriage had driven him to nervous collapse. Others speculated that the financial troubles of Willowbrook had unbalanced his mind. Celeste, for her part, played the role of the worried wife with masterful restraint. She expressed gentle concern for her husband's health, offering him rich stews and carefully brewed teas that he refused with visible dread. Her eyes would lower in quiet sorrow whenever guests remarked on his worsening appearance. To outsiders, she looked like a devoted spouse, struggling to care for a man slipping into madness. It was a performance so flawless that it transformed Aldrich's desperate caution into apparent lunacy. His refusal to eat her food appeared to be irrational fear, not intelligent self-preservation. His secretive cooking and hidden well were seen as symptoms of paranoia, not survival. Even his halting attempts to confide in Dr. Warren were dismissed as the ravings of a man whose mind had finally buckled under disgrace. No one, least of all the white planter families who still viewed the enslaved as incapable of complex cunning, could believe that a woman once held in bondage might possess the knowledge, patience, and will to carry out such a slow and methodical murder. The very idea seemed absurd. By late spring of 1854, Jeremiah Aldrich lived in a private hell. He knew with perfect clarity that his wife was poisoning him. He knew that Philip and Henri stood behind her, tightening the noose with every passing week. And yet, every effort to protect himself, every warning he tried to issue, only deepened the conviction of his neighbors and associates that he was losing his mind. He was in the most chilling sense both entirely correct and utterly powerless. Slowly, carefully, his body was failing. Slowly, carefully, his reputation was crumbling. And all the while, the two men who had orchestrated his ruin watched from the shadows, ensuring that when the end finally came, Jeremiah Aldrich would meet it alone, friendless, disbelieved, and convinced that the cold machinery of justice had finally caught him. Despite every cruelty and every careful plan he had once believed would keep him untouchable. The truth of Jeremiah Aldrich's doom was unveiled in a manner as cold and deliberate as the years of plotting that had brought him to this night. Celeste chose the setting with exquisite care, a dinner party to mark their 3-month wedding anniversary. She sent invitations to the few neighbors who still maintained a polite relationship with Willowbrook, despite the scandal of the marriage. Among them were Dr. Hamilton Warren and several prominent members of the parish's social circle, men and women whose presence would lend an air of respectability to what was in truth a carefully staged execution. Aldrich, steeped in his habitual paranoia, spent the day preparing for the evening with grim precision. He ate a secret meal hours beforehand and planned to touch nothing his wife had prepared. But when the guests arrived, Celeste unveiled a surprise that dismantled his defenses with a single gesture. She presented a bottle of wine supposedly drawn from the plantation's cellar untouched since before their marriage, as a toast to their bright future together. The bottle was displayed and uncorked in full view of the assembled company. The glasses were cleaned and filled under the watchful eyes of neighbors who would swear to the purity of the ritual. To refuse the toast would have been social suicide, a public admission of the very paranoia he had tried to conceal. With every gaze fixed on him, Aldrich raised the glass. As he lifted the wine to his lips, he caught Celeste's eyes across the table. For a single heartbeat, the mask of tender affection slipped, and beneath it flickered the cold satisfaction of a predator savoring the kill. The look was brief, but unmistakable. By the time the meaning registered, it was far too late. The poison worked quickly. Within minutes, violent cramps seized his stomach. A burning sensation crawled up his throat and into his chest. Breathing became a desperate, shallow struggle. He clutched at the table, then collapsed to the floor before a room full of witnesses who believed they were watching the final breakdown of a man long rumored to be spiraling into madness. Dr. Warren rushed to his side, but his efforts were hindered by Celeste's frantic performance. She threw herself across her husband's body, sobbing and pleading with the doctor to save him while subtly obstructing every attempt at treatment. Her anguish appeared so convincing that guests turned their attention to comforting the grieving wife rather than assisting the physician. As Aldrich writhed and gasped, Celeste leaned close enough for only him to hear. Her voice, low and steady, carried the final revelation that froze the last vestiges of life in his veins. "Marcus Devo was my cousin," she whispered. "Jeremiah Samuel Rochelle was my uncle by marriage. I have worked with Philippe and Henri since 1845, waiting for this moment to watch you die, as they died, slowly, painfully, and utterly alone." The words were a blade, sharpened by nearly a decade of patient hatred. In that instant, Aldrich understood the full depth of the trap. Celeste was no reluctant pawn. She was a willing architect of his destruction, bound to his enemies by blood and by vengeance. Every meal she had served, every gentle touch, every quiet evening beside the fire had been part of a performance designed to prolong his suffering and mask the method of his death. His vision narrowed to a dark tunnel. He could hear Celeste continuing her performance for the guests, begging Dr. Warren to try harder, calling on God to spare her beloved husband. Her voice, honeyed with false devotion, carried across the room even as his own breathing grew ragged and shallow. Around them, neighbors murmured reassurances and offered comfort, utterly convinced that they were witnessing a tragic accident rather than the final act of an 11-year vendetta. Jeremiah Aldrich died at 9:47 p.m. on June 18, 1854, on the floor of his own dining room. Dr. Warren's official report listed natural causes brought on by nervous exhaustion, a diagnosis that satisfied parish authorities and spared anyone the trouble of a deeper investigation. To those outside the circle of conspirators, it was the sad but unsurprising end of a man undone by financial ruin and domestic scandal. The funeral was well attended. Celeste, veiled in black and trembling with apparent grief, received the condolences of prominent families who offered to help her manage Willowbrook during her time of mourning. No one suspected that the tearful widow at the graveside was silently celebrating the flawless completion of the most intricate murder plot Louisiana society had ever seen. But the plan did not end with Aldrich's death. Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle had accounted for every contingency, including the disposition of the plantation and the fate of the woman who had been both accomplice and weapon. As Aldrich's legal wife Celeste inherited Willowbrook along with all its debts now controlled by Philippe and Henri through a web of financial institutions. Within a month, Celeste signed the necessary documents transferring the property to them in exchange for forgiveness of the crushing liabilities. Soon afterwards, she vanished from Louisiana, entirely taking with her a modest fortune and the freedom to begin a new life in a place where no one knew her past as either an enslaved woman or an avenger. The official record of Jeremiah Aldrich's death remained a minor curiosity, cited occasionally as a case of eccentric behavior brought on by stress and financial decline. Yet, among certain families of New Orleans and the surrounding parishes, another version survived, whispered from one generation to the next. It told of a conspiracy so patient, it spanned 11 years of a punishment so meticulously measured that every humiliation mirrored the original crimes. In those quiet circles, the story of Willowbrook Plantation became less a cautionary tale about madness and more a dark testament to the power of calculated revenge. Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle had achieved what no court of law would have dared attempt. They executed a death sentence without leaving a shred of evidence, using only money patience and an intimate understanding of how Louisiana's social order could be turned against itself. Their victory was not only in the death of Jeremiah Aldrich, but in the silence that followed, a silence so complete that history itself could be made to forget, even as certain families remembered and quietly marveled at the perfection of a justice that required no judge, no jury, and left no trace but the echo of a whispered name. The transformation of Willowbrook Plantation after Jeremiah Aldrich's death offered the final, undeniable proof of how carefully Philip and Henri had engineered their revenge. They did not sell the land for profit, nor did they preserve it as a monument to their victory. Instead, they reshaped it into something Aldrich himself would have found unthinkable. The grand house that had once welcomed Louisiana's wealthiest planters became a quiet refuge for freed men and women, a hidden station on the Underground Railroad. Families fleeing bondage found food shelter and a discreet path toward freedom in the North and in Canada. What had been a palace of human misery now became a sanctuary for liberation, a living rebuke to the man who had built his fortune on the buying and selling of lives. Remarkably, this transformation unfolded in plain sight. Philippe and Henri's carefully cultivated reputations as respectable businessmen provided perfect cover. Their legitimate commercial dealings masked the comings and goings at Willowbrook, while their social standing deflected suspicion from anyone curious about the plantation's new purpose. With patient precision, they used Aldrich's own wealth, his own property, and his own name to fight the very institution that had enriched him. And in doing so, they achieved something rarer than profit or even vengeance. They erased him. Jeremiah Aldrich did not merely die, he vanished. His fortune was scattered among the families of those he had wronged. His property served ideals that mocked everything he believed in. His reputation collapsed not through scandal or public trial, but through the slow decay of rumor until he remained in memory only as a foolish planter who squandered his resources and married unwisely. No monuments bear his name. No family line carries his blood forward. In the written record of Louisiana's turbulent antebellum years, he is little more than a shadow, a man who seemed to dissolve into the humid air of a state that never cared to remember him. Justice in this story did not come from the courts or the legislature. It came from human hands, patient, deliberate, and unbound by the systems that once protected men like Aldrich. In a society built to shield the powerful, Philip Henry and Celeste found a way to create their own reckoning and to make that reckoning permanent. What about you, dear listener? Do you believe every truth behind this tale has truly been revealed? Or do you suspect there are pieces of the story still hidden in the quiet soil of Louisiana? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this dark chapter of forgotten history kept you listening, be sure to subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share this story with someone who loves a good mystery. Until next time, may your dreams be peaceful and your nights free of the kind of justice that waits in silence for years before striking.